Hey gang, it's been another 2 weeks, and as promised, I'm here to take you on a quick tour of my new space. A lot of you have asked to see this, so without further ado, why don't I show you what I've built? So my space is actually in the basement of my house. Just gonna kind of give you a quick little overview here. It's not particularly big, just kind of tucked in a corner, and I made a point of using as much of the space as possible. Since we had to rebuild the basement from scratch, it all began as a sketch that I did, if you can see that here, just kind of giving a general sense of what I wanted everything to be like. And from there I progressed to an actual graphed out drawing with dimensions and a few more specifics that I used to figure out how much material I needed, what kind of material I needed, you know, how it was all going to fit into the space, and then from there I was able to build it. And as you can see, it's all, you know, it's basically just laminate shelving. You know, obviously not perfect, DIY 100%, but it does its job. It's kind of all designed to be very ergonomic. As you can see, I've got lots of soundproofing and sound isolating done in the space. But here, I'll just kind of begin left to right so you can see what's what. So over here I have a mobile just rack unit, which is a couple of units in here that really I make any use of. This first one down here, this is an Ensoniq Mirage. This is actually an 8-bit digital multi-sampler that came out in the 80s, and it's kind of goofy. As you can see, all the samples are stored on a little 768 kilobyte floppy diskette. And you know, this one's got some electric bass and piano sounds and stuff on it. You know, I actually bought this for like 20 bucks about 13 years ago. They couldn't find anyone who was interested in it. They practically paid me to take it off their hands for them, hence $20, down from the 100 something. And now these are actually kind of sought after, which is sort of neat. And I don't use it as much as I should. I'm sure one of these days it'll work its way into a project. Directly above it is the Yamaha TG77 rack unit. This is actually a rack version of the SY77. You know, so it's kind of like a Yamaha DX7, which is more famous, but it has 6 operators, and it has more than just sine waves, so it actually can make some pretty twisted noises. And actually what I like about it is that it's multi-timbral, which means that I can have more than one channel and kind of run more than one instrument. It actually has multiple outputs, so that if I ever want to go to the trouble of sort of routing it this way, I could actually use it as multiple synthesizers sort of in one box. But I've never actually gone to that trouble, since I don't. If I ever need to use more than one sound off of it, I actually have a digital version of the same synth that I got for free as part of the UVI Digital Sensations pack. So very handy unit. Again, this is a pawn shop find. They sold it for me for probably half of what it was worth, and it's sort of my first real FM synthesizer that I've had as hardware. Then above that, nothing fancy, just a real basic power conditioner, just to kind of keep things from humming too much. And above that, I have this old mixer that's just kind of there to fill space. It's not plugged in, I'm not using it. It's got spring reverb. Maybe one of these days I'll set up sort of a like an effects send, so that I can take advantage of that. But in the interim, it's not really that useful to me. It's just kind of here to store it, and also, you know, just like I said, it's not on, nothing powering it. It's just there to kind of fill this big empty space. Yeah, then up here, all the extra discs for that Ensoniq. Got tons of them, a few that I've made myself, you know, based on old samples and stuff like that. Down here into the desk, I've actually built a big empty rack space. Someday I can fill this with units and effects. I'd actually like to have some hardware compressors and hardware limiters to route stuff through eventually, but you know, someday. That's not a thing that's happening anytime soon. So over here, this is my MPA Gold dual preamp by Art. And what makes this kind of special is inside the preamp, the vacuum tubes that drive the unit have actually been swapped. So instead of running the cheap Chinese, just kind of real basic vacuum tubes that came with it originally, it's actually got some vintage mullered, like military grade radio tubes that give it a really warm and kind of fuzzy character whenever I record with it. And actually the left side, I was running at full voltage with a higher gain for my microphone, and the right side is actually for any instruments I have plugged in. So right now it's my guitar, but that just goes to a 1/4-inch output. And it's really neat because it has these built-in, like this high pass. There's a built-in high pass filter, so I can kind of filter out any noise on the unit before I actually throw it in to EQ it at all. And obviously I can adjust sort of my impedance and my input gain and all that stuff. And you can see the VUs go up and down when you record into it. It's a really slick unit. Below that, I have a super basic amplifier for powering my speakers and my monitors. This is actually a really old school way of doing this. Like these days, most of the monitors you're going to buy have amps built into them, but the ones that I have are actually passive, which means they need an amplifier to be driven, and it's kind of one more step in the chain that can add character, which is one of the reasons why I'm not necessarily in love with this unit. It was kind of one of those things where I bought these passive monitors thinking an amp I already had was going to do the job, and when it didn't, I needed to go with something a little more powerful, and this Alesis RA100 was sort of the only thing that sat in my price range. So maybe someday I'll have something that's got a little more heft to it, a little more, or excuse me, I say a little less character, that doesn't color the sound as much. This kind of rolls off the high end a bit, but for now it's doing its job. It's nice and accurate and flat for the most part. You know, we're kind of in that territory where going any higher is going to sort of be a point of diminishing returns. Which brings me, of course, to the actual monitors that I'm using. My primary monitors here are actually Event 2020s, which have been around for about 20 years or so. Actually, most notably used by Alan Parsons for a really long time. These were sort of, I was fishing for recommendations from some engineer friends of mine based on what I was seeing on Craigslist, and this was something that came up. They're nice, they're clean, they're flat, they didn't cost a fortune, they're nice and accurate where I need them to be. And then obviously that amp feeds over here to a switcher, which I'm actually surprised you can still get these days. 4, which is always pushed in here, actually goes to just a really basic subwoofer I have chilling on the floor over here. And then 1 and 2 go to another set of speakers I have up above to kind of reference on, just basic bookshelf speakers that I can use to kind of get a sense of what my stuff will sound like in more casual listening environments, or to listen for anything that I can't otherwise hear. But yeah, for the most part, the 2020s are doing their job about 90% of the time, so I don't miss out on anything that is picked up by only these bookshelf speakers. This very basic, very cheap JBL thing from the thrift store, and these set of Sonys that I've had since I was a teenager. They do a pretty good job of kind of highlighting any weird mid-range resonances I might have otherwise. Moving on from that, down here, we're getting a little closer to where sort of the action happens. So, as you can see, this is kind of where my controller zone is. I'm in the middle. I have a Novation Launch Key 61 that has seen some better days, unfortunately. It's kind of got some battle scars from playing some live shows, going on tour here and there. But this is where I do most of my work, is on this Launch Key 61. I really just fell in love with the way it feels. It has a really good tactile sensation about it. Nice amounts of feedback. And of course, the programmable knobs are really handy whenever I play a live show. To its left, I have a Behringer BCR 2000 that is programmed to control my Yamaha DX7, which we'll get to shortly. And on the other side, I have another BCR 2000 that's controlling my Alpha Juno 2, which we will also get to in a minute. Directly in front of me, you probably have all noticed this in pictures or in videos. My main display here, this is actually a 40-inch 4K TV that does the Chroma 424 or 422, I can't remember off the top of my head, decoding, so it actually gets, you actually get really crisp and clear text separation. Obviously not going to show up super well on a camera, but trust me, the input latency is nice, and nothing looks fuzzy or weird. That's the reason I went with this particular model of Samsung TV. And down below it, I have 2 planar touch screens that I can actually use to grab any of these faders and move them up and down. I sort of elected to do that. Undo that. Instead of having like an actual physical controller built into the desk. Just seemed to make more sense. Gives me more options for programmability. Granted, not using as often as I thought it would. It's maybe a little gimmicky, but you know, for what it is, I can't really argue with the ergonomics. I really do like that they're kind of laying there at an angle facing me so I can see everything all at once. I do have a mechanical keyboard down here, nothing particularly fancy, you know, designed obviously around gaming, which I don't do. I have all of my Sonar shortcuts on stickers that I've cut out and put on top of the keyboard so I can see everything, and then it glows a nice soft blue, so if I'm working in the dark I can still see everything. Moving over here, this is ostensibly sort of the nerve center of how my studio functions. Beginning down here, obviously another power conditioner for my units on this side of the space, and then in the middle is part of a modular audio interface made by Motu, Method of the Unicorn. The lower one is a 24IO, and the upper one is a 2408 Mark III. They both run on what's called an audio wire interface, which is basically their own version of Firewire. They don't support this anymore. They did when I bought it, obviously, but not anymore. This particular project is running at 441, but most of them these days I'm just kind of being super extra and doing it all 96. But basically these two devices, you can kind of buy any device that runs on this protocol and mix and match them into one big interface. So this one on the back of it is just 24 quarter-inch inputs and 24 quarter-inch outputs. And then this one is about 8 quarter-inch inputs and outputs, plus a few other things like a preamp for the monitors, plus a headphone jack, and then another output that I use for streams. And actually, it's really great because of the audio wire interface means I can run it at super, super low latency and not have a lot of distortion. Above that is one of my 3 MIDI interfaces. This one is just 8 in and 8 out. USB, super, super simple. It mounts into the rack, so I can kind of keep it under wraps like this. Had this for a while. So you can see I have some unused ports in the front in case I ever want to just like hot swap something that I don't use very often, even though right now everything is wired in. As we make our way further right, so to tuck back into this corner, I've got my 2 Korg Volca units. One is the Volca Beats, which is an analog drum machine, and actually on loan is a Volca Bass, which is just a very, very simple dual oscillator analog mono synth. Above that, I have an Alesis SR16 that I've had for, 15, 16 years. Super, super old school style drum machine. I used to use it a lot. It has really, really just like sharp, almost sort of like late 80s types of sounds. Not using it as much as I should these days, hence the dust. But it's a neat little thing I like having in my collection. Just every now and then I pull it out and do something with it. To the right of that is a Korg Monotron Duo, which is also technically an analog synthesizer, but I don't really use it as such since it doesn't have any MIDI capabilities, and it's just got this little tiny like kind of ribbon keyboard to control it. What I do use it for, though, that I have this jack, this cable here, it's actually you have the ability to route things through it and take advantage of the filters. So it actually has an analog style MS-20 type filter that I can route anything through, and I kind of leave it over in this corner because it's fun to, route like the Volca Beats through that and kind of make some mangled sounds. And kind of tucked way over here is my Talkbox that I've had for about 5 years now. It's actually routed from an output on my audio interface, so I can actually route any of the synths I want through the Talkbox, or anything really. Any sound coming out of my system can be routed through the Talkbox, and I can use that to record with. For those of you who don't know, what a Talkbox is, it's basically this tube is connected to a tiny but very powerful little speaker in this box, and what happens is you can drive sound out through it, stick this tube in your mouth and sort of form words around it. Chromeo is obviously a contemporary act that's done this a lot. Zapp and Roger, obviously Daft Punk, very, very famous for using a Talkbox. So it's a neat device. I used to use it a lot years ago, not using it as much as I used to. Maybe one of these days I'll get back into funk and R&B, and that'll all change. So the exciting stuff you guys have seen on the streams over and over again begins over on the far right side. So up above here is my Microkorg that I have had since 2004. So it's one of the first ones. And I've got a few custom patches on here that I've loaded or created over the years. But for the most part, nothing special about it, other than the fact you can see I've used it a lot. But still a really, really potent machine. Still has some really fat, high character type sounds. And it is where it is because I like to play with it. Down below that is a Moog Subphatty, which is a dual oscillator analog synth. Actually, technically it's 3. It's got this sub oscillator you can kind of ramp up and throw in there, but for the most part I use it like a dual oscillator synth, just because I didn't really want to throw down the money to get a mini Moog, and this seemed like a nice way to get some real Moog stuff in the studio without shelling out several $1,000s for a mini Moog. It's interestingly enough, I think they built it to make really fat basses, but I kind of like it as a lead synth more than anything. The filters and the oscillators just give it a really, really airy, rich quality whenever you make a lead with it. Obviously the filter is what makes it famous. So over here, this is a Roland Boutique JPO8, which is really just this top part. The keyboard part is separate, but I have them joined together because they slot nicely between here. And the JPO8 is a 4-note multi-timbral reproduction of the Roland Jupiter 8. The Jupiter 8 is one of the most highly sought after synths of the 80s, if I believe, because it's very rare and it's very expensive. It can be hard to get your hands on a real one, and the discrepancies between this one, this little reproduction, and the real one are so minute. I was just sold on needing to have it. So it's a multi-timbral analog synth, although some will argue with me about whether or not it's real analog based on the fact that there's microchips sort of driving the whole thing. But for the most part, it's an analog synth, so it's really great for really rich strings. There's a lot of really, classic 80s brass sounds that came off of these things. They're really great for thick basses. There's a guy on YouTube that has done entire recreations of certain Depeche Mode songs and Yazoo songs using only this. So I had buyer's remorse for about 2 seconds until I found those videos. And then once I realized, or rather, once I remembered how versatile it is, I knew I had made the right decision. Over here is a Korg MS-20 Mini, which is a full-on reproduction of the original MS-20, just about 80% the size. And they just basically dug the old schematics out of mothballs and just rebuilt them. So the difference is the old ones have a 1/4-inch jack for this patch bay, and the new ones have an 1/8-inch set of jacks for this patch bay. But it's granted, I don't have anything hooked up to show you how it sounds. This is a 100% analog piece of gear, whereas everything else in here has some kind of microchip in it or some kind of computer to keep track of everything. This is literally every function is on the machine. What you see is what you get. So that's probably, aside from the Volcas, the only piece of truly analog gear that is in here would be this MS-20 Mini. Above that is what's called an Alesis Micron, and actually I've had this for several years, and I go through phases. Sometimes I use it a bunch, sometimes I use it almost not at all. Right now I'm kind of in the not using it phase. I like to bring it with me if I'm traveling. It makes a great controller, but I haven't actually used much of the sound engine in this machine for a while, mostly because as you might imagine, with only a couple of sliders and some knobs and this tiny screen, it's not that easy to program. If you want to build new patches. What it is really great at is these things called setups, where you can actually have like some of these presets, and granted there's some that I've built myself. Down here triggers a sequence, in here some pads, and then up here is a lead, and it's all spanned out across this keyboard. And then you have you can program percussion beats too. So you could theoretically, if you didn't want to have a DAW or a computer with you, you could program this machine to do the brunt of your backup stuff. And kind of split it out. So this thing's real killer app is in a live setting, in my opinion. But I don't use it for that, so I'm kind of left wanting for a purpose for it at the moment. And I'm sure I'll find one. It has some really, really unique sounds kind of tucked within it. Alesis doesn't make synthesizers anymore, and this was sort of their swan song. This was sort of their greatest hits sort of thrown into one machine, which is one of the reasons why it's so special. Going down, this is kind of one of the unique things here. I have these sliding drawers, and so on the top one pulls out, and this is my DX7 II that I actually saved from being scrapped. It's kind of a funny story. I had a guest staying over in my former roommate's room. It was vacant, and when they went into the closet, they saw this. Said, "Hey, what's the deal with that keyboard up there?" And of course, I knew immediately what it was. This DX7 is one of the, if not arguably the most famous synthesizer of the 80s. I promise you've heard it. And my former roommate just said, "Hey, that's some piece of junk that I saved from being thrown away. I meant to take care of it and I never did. I'm so sorry." And me knowing what it was, I told him not to worry about it. I took it apart and soldered in a new battery, fixed a couple of broken keys, cleaned it up, and that was all it took to get it back to working condition. So now I have a perfectly functional Yamaha DX7 II that I can use for my productions, which is not a synth I would have ever purchased since it is emulated so well in software. but having the real thing here is pretty cool, and it definitely gives me some 80s synthwave bragging rights. What's even cooler is I have the original cartridges for it, plus some expansion cartridges. This machine was in use by the Santa Fe Opera, so it has not only expansion cartridges, but it also has the original box. I'm hanging on to all that in case I ever want to sell it. Obviously, in tandem with this programmer that I have set up for it, that gives me access to all of the parameters of the synth. Since the DX7's chief criticism was that it was really difficult to program, so this makes it easier for me to kind of dig in and mess with any parameters that I want to while I'm using it. On the next tier down, we have the Roland Synth Plus HS80, which is just a really fancy way of saying it's an Alpha Juno 2. What Roland would do is they would release home versions of their synthesizers, of the Juno, or say the Juno 106, the Alpha Juno 1, the Alpha Juno 2. They all got different designations like this, and the only thing that's different about it, you know, they say the HS80. The only thing that's different about it is they just gave it speakers. Otherwise, the hardware inside is 100% the same. If you compare this to a quote-unquote real Alpha Juno 2, the buttons and the functions are all the same. Like I said, the only thing that's different about it is they included speakers. And I have a programmer for that over here, since one of the chief criticisms of the Alpha series is that the only real control you had over its analog functions was this Alpha dial. So you wanted to adjust more than one parameter at once, you couldn't. Or you needed to buy a very expensive proprietary Roland programmer. But in the modern age, we can just take something like this, like a BCR 2000, program it for all the parameters, slap a template on top of it, and there's your programmer. Here are all my envelope controls, my cutoff filter, envelope depth, my resonance is over here. I can actually choose which waves I want mixed in. You have pulse wave, saw wave, subwave, and I can choose which waveform gets mixed in. So basically turns this sort of incomprehensible digital box into a very tactile analog machine, which is why I love these BCR 2000 units, which is the reason why I have two. Just fantastic. And then sliding down one more, this is my Ensoniq ESQ1, which was not something I was planning on purchasing, not something I necessarily chased after, but it's really unique. So you can actually do this thing where you could buy these expansion cartridges that contain more waveforms, load them in the machine, and then start building pads or pull up presets off of that based on added waveforms. This particular one isn't that exciting to me. It's mostly like pianos and guitars, it's strummed instruments, since people were sort of chasing after that. This is about the same era as the Mirage you saw earlier. You can tell kind of the buttons are very much the same. You will have heard this particular synth in Red Light Syndrome. The bass sound came right off of it. I think it was actually honestly just this patch right here that I processed a whole bunch. I actually had this, I played a couple shows with this, and the TSA in Seattle took it apart because this screw was in when I left and it was gone when I got home. So I know the TSA took it apart, which is why I don't travel with expensive gear anymore. And let's see here, and then down here, I have an empty slot, speculation purposes, and then I have a foot controller for the DX7 that you can use to control various aspects of certain patches. Then over here, I have my guitar, nothing too special. It's just an Epiphone Strat that is lefty that I sort of replaced all the pickups on, and I like it because it kind of has this like Batman style head on it. I think it's a really unique look. And then, like I said, down here it's all black on black. I've only played out with this once. I'm not much of a guitar player, but nice and clean. I can make it sound like just about anything I want in software. So if I need to do some guitar work and I don't want to hire or bring in one of my session guys, I can just pick this up and go to town. Down here, you already saw the subwoofer, but back here is my computer that I built 3 years ago and kind of been upgrading ever since. At the heart of it, it's an Intel i7 4770K, not overclocked, just running at 3.5 gigahertz with hyper-threading and all that. Got 32 gigs of RAM, and I probably somewhere around 4 terabytes of storage total. I'm kind of a crazy person. My primary drive is actually 2 solid states in a RAID 0 configuration that I back up to conventional drives. So I have stupid fast access times, which even though you'd never notice because Sonar takes forever to load, but it's absolutely overbuilt and currently running Windows 10 Pro. Only other thing I haven't covered is some of the more incidental stuff. So I have obviously lots and lots of sound insulation. Some of it came from a kit, some of it came from the surplus store. The one directly above me I actually built myself. It's actually, you can't really see this, it's a wooden frame with some insulation inside of it, with some fabric stretched across it. All my vocals are done here on an AT2035 microphone running into that preamp you saw earlier with this really, really basic homemade isolator because, as you may have noticed in some of the pictures, directly behind my microphone is a vent. So to make sure we don't get any of that vent noise, I have this isolator right here to make sure that everything's nice and quiet when I do my takes. And then kind of back in this corner is just sort of the aesthetic part. So I have an autograph picture here of Michael Bien that I got at Emerald City Comic Con a number of years ago. And then above here I have an autograph from Ian Corlett. I met him at a convention. He was actually there when I was sound checking, and he really liked what I was doing, so he made a little note of writing here. Music is Ultra Gear, which is Cheetor's catchphrase in Beast Wars, which is a Transformers series I grew up watching, so I was pretty stoked to do that. That kind of made my weekend, so. Alright, thank you so much. That wraps up my quick little overview of what I've constructed and what I use to do all my stuff now. And if you have any questions or comments about anything you've seen, be sure to leave them below, and I will try to get back to you and answer as much as I can. More live streams coming up soon, and as always, if you like what you're seeing, be sure to subscribe, and my inbox on both Facebook and Twitter are open to you, so please feel free to drop me a line at any time.